Not too long ago on the channel, I made a video talking about effective ways to warm up, different components to a warm-up protocol, and a lot of you really enjoyed it. So in this video, I'm going to go the other end of the session now. We're talking about cool downs, active recovery, stretching, foam rolling, things like that useful as well. Maybe some things on nutrition and hydration, but how can we really kickstart the recovery process and accelerate that recovery process after our sessions during the week? So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple. And in this video today, we're talking all about post-session habits that are really effective to get into to make sure we make the most of our recovery. So the first thing I'm going to talk through is the cool down component. If we think about a typical training session for most people, regardless of your sport, it's going to have a warm up, it's going to have a main session or the key part, whatever you like to call it. And then it's going to have this cool down recovery little period at the end before we go about the rest of our day or do what else we need to do, get ready for another training session, etc. So in this little part at the end, the point of this for the most part, particularly in the endurance sports, is to just continue a little bit of oxygen supply. We want to keep the blood flow happening around the body, really for the purpose of, one, delivering some nutrients and oxygen to the working muscles to allow the processes to keep functioning. Because as soon as we stop the main session, that's not bang, we just drop straight back to our normal resting state, or heart rate comes back down straight away immediately, and we're into a recovery phase already. It takes a little bit of time to get down there. As you'll notice at the end of each interval you might do, or at the end of a session, see your heart rate's up and it slowly comes back down over the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes. We want to come down with that process, and by keeping the body moving in what we call an active recovery, so very, very low intensity, same movements or same body parts involved. So if you're running, an active recovery might just be a sort of a moderate walk or a very, very slow jog. On the bike, it might be just dropping down to sort of 30, 40, 60 watts, really easy spin. But the point of keeping things moving is what we do is we engage the skeletal muscle pump. So all that is the muscles keep contracting. Ultimately, that keeps pushing and compressing on the blood vessels. And particularly from a running perspective, or most of our endurance sports, we're in this sort of upright position. So a lot of the blood going through the body, that all the metabolic byproducts, so things like lactic acid, particularly the hydrogen ion, the acidic part, they get caught up down in the lower body, because in terms of our blood flow, our blood's at its highest pressure, or its, I guess, fastest movement, if you like, or easiest amount of movement coming away from the heart. So when it's going out to the body, coming back to the heart, it's under its lowest pressure. But also, if you think about the blood down the legs in particular, if you're standing upright as a runner, it's very hard to get it back up to the heart because it's under low pressure and it has to work all the way up against gravity. So what we want to do here is continuously move. Muscles keep contracting. They then, in terms of their contraction, compress the blood vessels and act as a bit of a pump, almost like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube to get the blood back up to the heart. Through the system, we get oxygen back in. What it also does is it starts to flush out some of the metabolic byproduct accumulation, or that if you ever have that deadness feeling in your legs, you might have a bit of swelling in the legs if you've done a big session. Similar thing to when you're on a long haul flight. Not that many people are doing that at the moment, but maybe if you're sitting in a car for a long period of time, ankles and calves start to swell up a little bit, do a bit of movement, we get the blood flow happening again. That's all that's really happening here, but it's really effective in terms of just keeping the oxygen consumption up a little bit to help accelerate a bit of this recovery process. We can clear out a little bit more blood lactate, or that acidity in the legs, the byproducts in the legs, a little bit quicker in that first 5, 10, 15 minutes. That's really going to accelerate the recovery in terms of 2 or 3 or 4 hours post, maybe even going into the next day, compared to if we just sit down and let it accumulate and sort of naturally slowly come out. It's just a much faster process. Flush it out nice and quick in the first 5, 10 minutes, and we're going to be all good. As I said, you don't have to do much of this. It's very, very low intensity, 5, 10 minutes, and it could be something like just going for a 5 or 10 minute walk after your session is a really effective way of doing it. In terms of, I guess, other things to do from a habits perspective that might aid this process, things like getting a massage, or maybe foam rolling, using the compressive recovery boots, all of these things aid this similar skeletal muscle pump process. They're not going to be necessarily any better or worse. There might be some advantages to things like recovery boots. You can sit down and basically that process happening for you, so it gives you time to get your nutrition in. I really like that component, but there's no direct science to say that foam rolling is going to be a dramatic improver on your performance or recovery because it's a foam rolling methodology versus going for a walk. It might more come down to, do you feel better after doing something like foam rolling, or even something like stretching has a bit of controversy in terms of sometimes or previously in years gone by, we go, oh, stretching's really, really good. We need to do that in our warm up. And now people are more so these days, people say, don't really do some static stuff in your warm up. Some people don't like doing it all. Some people like doing lots, and you could come out with the same performance outcome. So all of these little things here probably aren't necessarily a big key ticket item or something that you have to do, but it might help that little process. And like I said, if it's something that's going to make it a bit more practical and you have access to it, maybe you don't have access to get a massage, but you have a foam roller and you want that sensation of, all right, I'm just working the muscle a little bit, just moving some blood around, which effectively that's what foam rolling is, compression on the muscle, or massage, compression, pushing that blood, allowing that blood to come back up to the heart a little bit more effectively. If you've got access to recovery boots, great. You can sit down and get some nutrition and get some hydration in at the same time you're doing that active recovery. Awesome, but they're not necessarily a necessity. It's more of an add-on to, I would still be going and doing your 5-10 minutes of active recovery immediately post your session to start that process, and then you can jump into that other stuff later. As I already mentioned with the recovery boot equation, it's really useful in terms of getting your nutrition and hydration. And I would argue that that's probably the more important part to then consider. So do an active recovery and some of these other processes, but then nutrition and hydration is really, really critical. Depending on the type of session, so whether you've done some high intensity interval training, or you've done some long intervals, a long slow zone 2 session, a short zone 2 session, depending on what you're coming out of, your nutrition and hydration will vary. So if you've done a really long 3-4 hour zone 2 session, you might have been out there for a long period of time, sweating quite a bit. Things like hydration is going to be really critical. Aiming for something like 1.2 to 1.5 times what you've lost is a really good starting point, particularly in terms of your long sessions or your big hard sessions. If you've done a short high intensity interval training session and maybe had some rest breaks in between where you've had time to get a bit of a sip, you probably don't need to be putting massive amounts of fluid back in immediately post, because the session might have only actually gone for sort of 40 or 45 minutes. I would still be hydrating though, because even after the session, particularly if you're someone who sweats quite a bit, you're probably going to be continuing to sweat. Even if you go and have a cool shower, things like that, you might actually be continuing to sweat through that process in the recovery and the cool down period. So you're actually losing a bit more than what you thought. It's not just fluid lost in the main set, it's fluid lost across the whole session. So warm up, cool down, and main set included. So getting that fluids back in, you might want to get a little bit of carbohydrate in that as well, but probably water for the most part is going to be really effective. Maybe a little bit of electrolyte in there to help with the absorption. A little bit of sodium is just going to help sort of get that fluid in and retain it, rather than just drinking lots of water and just sweating it all back out or having to go to the toilet a lot. Having a bit of electrolyte could be useful in that process too. Again, not a necessity, the electrolyte. Probably more so if you're sweating lots. Just want to get some sort of fluid back in and aim to replenish at least what we've I guess lost in the session, but maybe a little bit more to compensate for that continuing to sweat process and going to the toilet, things like that afterwards. The other thing we need to consider is, well, from a nutrition perspective, I'm going to keep this really simple because there's a lot of different guidelines depending on what you're doing. But ultimately, we want to get some sort of carbohydrate back in, because we've probably been burning a large amount of carbohydrates, particularly as endurance athletes working at reasonably good intensities. We're going to be using a lot of carbs in that session, so we need to replenish that muscle glycogen. So get some carbs back in. Doesn't necessarily have to be a huge meal if it's been a short session. If it's been a much bigger session, you might be wanting a bigger meal. But you want to be getting something back in, probably sort of that 45 an hour after your session is really critical to make sure in that window you've had something to eat. I would also be including a little bit of protein in that, and particularly the harder the session is and the more you sort of feel like there might be a little bit of damage to the body, might be a long 3-4 hour session, I'd be including the protein, one, because it's going to help with repair and restoration of the system in terms of muscle damage, tendon damage, anything like that. But two, the combination of carbohydrate and protein works really, really effectively to increase the uptake. So whether it's carbohydrate being uptaken in the muscle a little bit better, but particularly the protein side of things, when you combine it with carbs, we get a little bit better uptake of that protein rather than it just coming into the body and going straight back out. We're not using it. We can help actually resynthesize some of the proteins in the system, and that is a much better kickstart for our recovery process, because more capacity or greater capacity to restore and repair any damage that's internal when you get later on into your recovery phase in terms of going in through and having a good quality sleep that night, ready for the next day. That's where we're going to get our most bang for buck from that protein aspect. And if we can absorb and take on as much of it as possible in terms of within that time frame, and don't have to go excessive on the protein aspect, but getting some in is going to be useful. That's going to help go a long way to beginning and really getting right into some positive recovery, which at the end of the day, we know the recovery process is really, really critical to then be able to get those adaptations. You can fatigue yourself as much as you like, but if you don't have that adequate recovery and appropriate recovery, And using some of these tips, particularly things like active recoveries to get you through those initial acute fatigue stages, and get you into that good recovery process, and focus on some other things like repairing the body and the adaptation cycle. We're sort of just going to continue to fatigue. We're not going to see some upswings in performance. So getting some of this stuff right is really, really critical. So hopefully you got a little bit of info around what I tend to think about in terms of thought process for post-session, the cool down component, and some really good post-session habits. What are some things you do after your session, immediately after you finish the main set? Let me know in the comments down below. Are there any strategies you already have in place or any processes you go through? Always happy to hear and discuss your ideas and thoughts as always. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there today. Hopefully you got a bit out of it, and we'll see you in the next one.